Ambassador Kyelvith stood at the center of the great hall, his four eyes scanning the thousands of alien delegates who had gathered for the memorial ceremony that happened once every 100 years, and he felt the familiar weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing a planet of breathtaking beauty with blue oceans and green forests and white clouds swirling across its surface, and every species in the hall knew what they were looking at even before the name appeared in glowing letters. Earth, home of the humans, home of the species that had vanished from existence 2,000 years ago. Kyelvith raised his arms in the traditional gesture of remembrance and spoke the words that had been spoken at every memorial, since the vanishing began to fade from living memory into legend. "We gather today to remember those who are gone," he said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber through translation devices that converted his words into 800 different languages. "We remember the humans, who walked among the stars for 3 centuries before silence claimed them forever." The delegates bowed their heads in a show of respect, but Kyelvith knew that many of them felt something other than grief in their hearts, and he could not blame them because he had read the histories and he understood why the galaxy had feared the strange beings from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The humans had been unlike anything the conquered of united species had ever encountered before. They had emerged onto the galactic stage with a hunger that terrified the elder races, spreading across 200 worlds in just 300 years, breeding and building and expanding at a rate that made the other species nervous, and their technology advanced so quickly that scientists from civilizations 10 times older could barely keep up with their innovations. Kyelvith remembered the stories his grandmother had told him when he was young, stories about the humans she had met during her time as a trade negotiator on the border worlds. "They burned with something we could not name," she had said, her old eyes distant with memory. "They laughed too loud and loved too fiercely and dreamed too big, and when you looked into their eyes you saw a fire that never seemed to rest." The conquered had watched the humans with growing concern as the decades passed, and eventually the leaders of the great civilizations had gathered in secret to discuss what they called the human problem. Kyelvith knew the truth that most delegates preferred to forget. The conquered had implemented a containment doctrine against humanity, cutting off their trade routes and restricting their territorial expansion, and isolating them from the rest of galactic civilization. And there had been whispers of something worse in the classified archives, whispers of plans for intervention if the humans refused to accept their place in the order of things. But none of those plans had ever been needed, because the humans had simply disappeared. The holographic display shifted to show the timeline of the vanishing, and Kyelvith watched as world after world went dark in the span of a single standard year. First, the colony on Proxima Centauri stopped responding to communications. Then the mining stations in the outer systems fell silent. Then the great shipyards of Mars and the research facilities of Europa and the agricultural domes of Venus all went quiet at once. And finally Earth itself, the cradle of human civilization, transmitted its last message and joined its children in the void of silence. The conquered had sent investigation teams to every human world, expecting to find battlefields littered with bodies or cities ravaged by plague, or some other explanation for the sudden end of an entire species. Instead, they found nothing. The cities were empty but intact, the power systems cold but undamaged, the streets clean and the buildings standing, and everything in perfect order, as if the humans had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any minute. But they never returned. Billions of humans had vanished without leaving a single body behind, without any sign of violence or disease or disaster, and the mystery had haunted the galaxy ever since. Theories multiplied over the centuries like bacteria in a petri dish. Some said the humans had committed mass suicide through some unknown method that left no trace, But psychologists who studied human behavior said this was impossible because humans clung to life with a desperate strength that bordered on madness. Some said a plague had swept through their worlds and consumed even the dead, but biologists found no evidence of any pathogen capable of such complete destruction. Some said the humans had turned on each other in a final civil war that ended with mutual annihilation, but military analysts found no signs of battle and no weapon signatures and no debris fields in orbit around their worlds. And some whispered that the humans had simply left, that they had found a way to escape the galaxy entirely and had chosen exile over the slow, strangling death the conquered had planned for them. This theory disturbed Kylvath the most because it suggested that humanity had known about the containment doctrine and had responded not with war but with abandonment, and he could not decide if that made them wiser or more frightening than anyone had imagined. The ceremony ended with the traditional moment of silence, and Kylvath watched as the delegates filed out of the Great Hall, already returning to their endless political games and economic negotiations and territorial disputes. He lingered behind, walking slowly through the museum wing, where artifacts from the human era were preserved behind glass cases. A child's toy made of soft fabric and shaped like a four-legged earth creature. A blade of rusted metal with a handle wrapped in ancient leather. A book of poetry with pages yellowed by time, the words inside written in a human language that scholars still struggled to fully understand. Kylvath stopped in front of the book and tried to read the title on its cover, sounding out the strange syllables in his mind. "Do not go gentle into that good night," he murmured, and even though he did not fully understand the meaning, something about the words made him shiver. He retired to his quarters as the station's artificial lights dimmed to simulate evening, and he tried to sleep, but could not because his grandmother's voice kept echoing in his memories. "They burned with something we could not name." The emergency alarm shattered his restless thoughts 3 hours later. Kylvath rushed to the command center and found the night shift crew staring at their displays with expressions of pure shock, and when he looked at the main screen he understood why. A ship had emerged from the void at the edge of conquered space, in a region where no ship should exist, from a direction that led only to the empty darkness between galaxies. The station's identification system cycled through its database of 50,000 known species configurations, searching for a match to the vessel's design. No match found. The system dug deeper, accessing historical archives that had been locked for 2,000 years, comparing the ship's structure to records that most people had forgotten existed. A result appeared on the screen. Structural correlation, 973%. Species of origin, human. Kylvath felt his 4 hearts stop beating for a moment as he stared at the impossible word, and around him, the command crew began to whisper in voices filled with fear. The humans had not died. The humans had not ascended to some higher plane of existence. The humans had simply been somewhere else for 2,000 years. And now they were back. 3 months had passed since the impossible detection, and the galaxy had changed in ways that Dr. Stephen Mox could feel in the nervous energy of every being she encountered. The Velith scientist stood on the observation deck of the research vessel Theorem of Equanimity, watching the stars streak past as the ship traveled toward the edge of known space, and she clutched her data tablet like a shield against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had spent her entire career studying human ruins, walking through their empty cities and cataloging their abandoned possessions, and trying to understand the species that had vanished before she was born. And now, she was traveling to meet them in person. The thought made her feel both terrified and strangely excited. The Conquered had classified the sensor data at the highest level, but rumors had spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. And now, every species was whispering the same impossible words. "The humans are back." Captain Voreth entered the observation deck and stood beside her, his massive form blocking out a portion of the starfield. "We will reach the coordinates in 6 hours," he said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Are you prepared for what we might find?" Steven shook her head slowly. "I have studied humans for 40 years," she said. "I have read their books and examined their art and walked through their homes, but I have never spoken to one, and I am not sure anyone can be prepared for that." The captain made a sound that might have been agreement and left her alone with her thoughts. When the theorem finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the designated coordinates, the crew found nothing but empty space stretching in all directions. "Scan the area," Captain Voreth ordered, and the sensor operators began their work with trembling hands. For several minutes, nothing appeared on their instruments, and Steven began to wonder if the original detection had been some kind of mistake or malfunction. Then one of the operators gasped and pointed at her screen. "There is something here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A fold in space itself, hidden like a door that no one was meant to find." Before anyone could respond, the fold opened. A ship emerged from the impossible doorway, and then another, until the space around the theorem was filled with vessels that made their research ship look like a child's toy. The human dreadnoughts were massive beyond anything in the conquered fleet, their hulls gleaming with technologies that Steven's instruments could not identify, and they moved with a silent grace that seemed almost organic. 100 ships surrounded them, and then 200, and then 500, and still more kept coming through the fold. Captain Voreth gripped the arms of his command chair so hard that the metal groaned beneath his fingers. "They could destroy us in an instant," he said, and Steven could hear the fear in his voice despite his efforts to hide it. But the human ships did not attack. They simply waited, forming a perfect sphere around the theorem with mathematical precision, their weapons silent and their shields lowered. A transmission reached the research vessel, and when the communications officer played it through the speakers, Steven heard a voice speaking perfect galactic standard with an accent that had been dead for 2,000 years. "We know you," the voice said, calm and clear and somehow gentle despite the power behind it. "We remember what you did, and we remember what you plan to do. But do not be afraid, because we are not here for vengeance. We are here to speak, and you will listen." The bridge fell silent as every crew member tried to process the impossible message. Steven stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overwhelming her fear. "May I respond?" she asked Captain Voreth, and after a long moment he nodded his permission. She activated the communication system and spoke into the void. "This is Dr. Steven Mox of the conquered research vessel Theorem of Equanimity," she said. "I have spent my life studying your people, trying to understand what happened to you, and now I need to know the truth. Where have you been for 2,000 years? The response came after several seconds of silence. "We have been in the dark between galaxies, in the void where no other species has ever survived, and we have been preparing." "Preparing for what?" Steven asked. "For this moment," the voice replied, "and for what comes after." Over the following hours, the humans shared fragments of data with the theorem, and Steven pieced together a story that broke her heart and filled her with awe at the same time. Humanity had known about the containment doctrine. They had intercepted the secret communications between conquered leaders, and they had understood that their species faced a choice between war and slow extinction. Some humans had wanted to fight, arguing that their technology was advancing fast enough to give them a chance at victory. But others had pointed out that even a successful war would cost billions of lives on both sides. In the end, humanity had chosen a third option. They had developed technology to breach the galactic barrier, the wall of radiation and gravitational chaos that separated the Milky Way from the endless void beyond, and they had left their home galaxy entirely. Every human on every world had participated in the Exodus, a migration of billions that took only a single year to complete, and when the last ship passed through the barrier, they had sealed the doorway behind them. For 2,000 years, they had survived in the intergalactic void, building new homes on rogue planets and artificial habitats, facing challenges that would have destroyed lesser species, growing and changing and evolving into something new. And now they had returned. Seven transmitted a report to the conquered leadership, and within hours the galaxy was in chaos. Emergency sessions convened on 1,000 worlds as political leaders demanded to know what the humans wanted, and military commanders argued about the best way to respond to the threat. Some called for immediate attack, insisting that humanity must be destroyed before they could take revenge for the containment doctrine. Others urged caution, pointing out that the human fleet was larger and more advanced than anything the conquered could field. And a few voices, drowned out by the shouting, suggested that perhaps the galaxy should simply ask the humans what they wanted instead of assuming the worst. Seven ignored the political chaos and focused on the data the humans had shared, and buried in the technical specifications and historical records, she found something that terrified her more than any threat of war. The humans had not returned to conquer the galaxy. They had returned to warn it. That night she composed a personal message to the human fleet, a single question born from decades of studying their abandoned civilization. "Why did you come back?" The response arrived in seconds, and when Seven read it, she felt the universe shift beneath her feet. "Because the galaxy is about to face something worse than us," the message said. "Something that is coming from the void between galaxies, something that consumes everything in its path, and despite everything that was done to us, we remember that the Milky Way is our home too." Seven stared at the words until her eyes began to water. The humans had spent 2,000 years in exile, driven from their home by fear and hatred, and they had returned not with weapons drawn but with hands extended in warning. She did not know if she should feel grateful or ashamed. Perhaps both feelings were appropriate. The great assembly hall of the conquered had never been so crowded, with delegates from every member species packed into seats that stretched upward toward a ceiling painted with images of galactic unity, and every eye in the room was fixed on the single human who stood at the central podium. Her name was Rear Admiral Yuki Tanaka, and she claimed to be 2,347 years old. She looked no older than 40 by human standards, her black hair streaked with silver and her dark eyes carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone who met her gaze, and she wore a uniform of deep blue that bore symbols no alien could read. The hall fell silent as she began to speak. "I was born on Earth," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I was 17 years old when my people made the decision to leave, and I remember standing on a hill outside my family's home and looking up at the stars and wondering if I would ever see them again." She paused and let her words settle over the assembly like a blanket. "We knew what you planned for us," she continued. "We intercepted your communications and decoded your classified documents and watched as your leaders debated whether to contain us or destroy us, and we understood that you feared what we might become." A murmur rippled through the delegates, and Tanaka raised her hand to silence it. "I am not here to accuse you or to demand apologies," she said. "The beings who made those decisions are dead, and their descendants should not carry the weight of their sins, but I need you to understand why we left so that you can understand why we came back." She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the hall with images of stars and galaxies, and the vast emptiness between them. "We spent 2,000 years in the void," she said. "We built cities on rogue planets that drifted through the darkness. We constructed habitats that could sustain millions in the cold between galaxies. We learned to survive in conditions that would kill any other species within hours." The images shifted to show human settlements. strange and beautiful structures that glowed with artificial light against the absolute blackness of intergalactic space. "And while we were out there, we found something," Tanaka said, and her voice dropped to a tone that made every delegate lean forward in their seats. "We found the reason why the space between galaxies is empty." The holographic display changed again, and now it showed something that defied easy description, a vast darkness that seemed to consume light itself, spreading across the image like ink dropped into water. "We call it the silence," Tanaka said. "It is not a creature or a machine or a force of nature. It is something else entirely, something that exists to consume intelligent life wherever it finds it." She showed recordings from human expeditions, images of galaxies that had once been filled with stars and planets and civilizations, now reduced to cold and empty shells where nothing lived and nothing thought and nothing dreamed. "It moves slowly," she explained, "crossing the space between galaxies over millions of years, but it is patient and it is thorough, and every galaxy it touches is stripped clean of everything that ever achieved consciousness." The delegates watched in horrified silence as the recordings played, showing world after world reduced to barren rock, showing star systems that had been picked clean of any trace of the civilizations that once inhabited them. "We verified this data ourselves," said a Thessari scientist from the back of the hall, and Tanaka nodded in acknowledgement. "Your scientists have confirmed what we discovered," she said. "The silence is real, it is coming, and it will reach the Milky Way within 300 years. The hall erupted into chaos as delegates shouted questions and accusations and demands for more information, and Tanaka stood calmly at the podium and waited for the noise to subside. When it finally did, she spoke again. "We spent 2,000 years preparing for this fight," she said. "We developed weapons and defenses that you cannot imagine. We trained our children and their children and their children's children for the battle that we knew would come, and we are ready to face the silence." She paused and looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of delegates from dozens of different species. "But we cannot win alone." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. "We are offering you an alliance," Tanaka said. "We will share our technology and our knowledge and our warriors. We will stand beside you against the darkness that is coming. We will fight and die to protect the galaxy that drove us into exile." A Thessari military commander rose from his seat, his face twisted with suspicion. "And what do you want in return?" he demanded. "What is the price for this generous offer?" Tanaka looked at him for a long moment before answering. "We want you to remember what you did," she said. "We want you to acknowledge the containment doctrine and the plans for our destruction. We want you to admit that you tried to strangle a young species simply because you feared what we might become." The commander's face darkened with anger. "You expect us to believe this story of some cosmic threat," he said. "Perhaps you are fabricating this enemy to frighten us into submission. Perhaps this is nothing more than an elaborate plan to conquer the galaxy through fear." Other delegates nodded in agreement, and the hall filled with murmurs of suspicion. Tanaka listened to the accusations without any change in her expression, and when the noise died down, she responded with a patience that seemed to stretch across centuries. "We could have returned with vengeance," she said. "We had 2,000 years to nurture our anger, to sharpen our hatred into weapons, to plan the destruction of every species that plotted against us." She stepped away from the podium and walked toward the center of the hall, looking up at the painted ceiling with something like sadness in her eyes. "Instead, we chose to grow beyond our pain," she said. "We chose to become something better than our worst moments. We chose to come back and offer our hands to the species that once wanted us dead." She turned back to face the assembly. "What you do with our warning is your choice," she said. "But know this. We will fight the silence whether you stand with us or not. We did not survive the void to watch our home galaxy die." That night, while the conquered debated and argued and struggled to decide what to do, The long-range sensor networks detected a new anomaly at the far edge of the galaxy. Something vast was emerging from intergalactic space, something that blocked out the light of stars as it moved, something that the sensors could not identify because it was unlike anything in their databases. The silence had arrived 300 years ahead of schedule. It knew that humanity was here. And it was hungry. The first year of the war was a nightmare that no species in the galaxy would ever forget. The silence swept through the outer rim like a plague of darkness, consuming 3 civilizations before the conquered could organize any kind of defense, and the refugees who escaped spoke of horrors that made even hardened soldiers weep. Reality itself seemed to break apart wherever the silence touched, with physics becoming unreliable and faster-than-light travel failing without warning, and entire fleets vanished into the void without sending a single distress signal. Desperation did what diplomacy could not. The conquered officially allied with the returned humanity, forming what the leaders called the Galactic Defensive Pact, and human admirals took command of combined fleets that included ships from species that had once plotted their extinction. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of her flagship, the last light of Earth, and watched as conquered vessels fell into formation around her fleet. "They are afraid of us," said her second-in-command, a void-born human named Chen who had never seen a planet until the return. "They should be," Tanaka replied, "but not as afraid as they should be of what is coming." The first major battle of the Alliance took place in the Verath system, where the silence had trapped a colony of 3 billion Thessari civilians. The conquered ships arrived first, their weapons blazing against an enemy that seemed to absorb their attacks without effect, and within minutes half the fleet was dead or dying. Then the human dreadnoughts emerged from fold space, and the conquered crews witnessed what their ancestors had feared for so long. The human ships were not merely vessels of metal and energy. They were something more, something that blurred the line between machine and organism, their hulls shifting and adapting to damage in ways that seemed almost alive. Human soldiers operated in perfect synchronization, their thoughts linked across neural networks that allowed them to react as a single organism, moving with a speed and precision that made the conquered's best warriors look clumsy. Their weapons did not fire beams of light or missiles of metal. They manipulated the fundamental forces of the universe itself, bending gravity and time and the quantum fabric of reality to tear holes in the silence that no ordinary weapon could create. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, the silence had retreated for the first time since the war began. But the human victory came at a cost, with 17 ships destroyed and over 40,000 soldiers dead, and Tanaka stood in the memorial hall of her flagship and read the names of the fallen while her crew watched in silence. "They died well," Chen said, and Tanaka shook her head. "They died young," she replied, "just like every generation before them, sacrificing themselves for a galaxy that tried to kill us." Despite their terrible power, the humans remained human in ways that surprised the conquered observers who served aboard their ships. They laughed and told jokes during quiet moments between battles. They mourned their dead with songs and poems that brought tears to alien eyes. They fell in love and argued about trivial things, and worried about their families and dreamed of peace. A young Velith officer named Sivan Tao, granddaughter of the scientist who had made first contact with the returned, served as a liaison aboard a human destroyer called the Remember What We Were. She expected to find cold warriors hardened by 2,000 years of exile, but instead she found people who played games with their children and cooked meals together, and celebrated birthdays with cake and candles. "I do not understand," she told the ship's captain one evening. "You have every reason to hate us, yet you treat us with kindness." The captain, a woman whose family had been exiled from Earth when she was still in her mother's womb, smiled sadly. "Hatred is heavy," she said. "We carried it for a few generations. But eventually, We realized that it was weighing us down more than the void ever could, so we set it aside and focused on building something better. The war continued through months that felt like years, with victories and defeats and moments of hope, followed by crushing losses. At the Battle of Velith Prime, the human dreadnought remember what we were faced a silence harvester that was moving to consume a world of 3 billion civilians. The ship was damaged, its weapons nearly depleted, its crew exhausted from weeks of constant combat. Captain Yuki Tanaka III, granddaughter of the admiral, made a decision that would echo through history. She ordered her ship to ram the harvester at maximum speed, using the vessel's full drive to create an explosion that tore the enemy apart from the inside. The Remember What We Were was destroyed instantly, along with everyone aboard. But the 3 billion Velith civilians survived. The final transmission from the ship was recorded by every vessel in the fleet, the crew singing an ancient human hymn about finding home, their voices steady even as death approached. The Velith, who had been the most vocal opponents of the alliance, declared a day of mourning that lasted for an entire year. Statues of human soldiers began appearing on conquered worlds, erected by species that had once voted to contain humanity forever. Admiral Tanaka received the news of her granddaughter's death in the middle of a strategy session, and for a moment, her ancient face showed every one of her 2,000 years. "How do you endure this?" asked a Thessari general who had lost his own son in an earlier battle. "We learned in the void that survival without purpose is just prolonged death," Tanaka replied. "We came back for a reason, and that reason matters more than our grief." 6 months later, human scientists working with the Concord's best researchers discovered a potential weakness in the silence. The enemy was not random or mindless. It was coordinated by a central node hidden in the void between galaxies, a structure that processed information and directed the harvest across millions of years. If that node could be destroyed, the silence would fall. But reaching it would require a fleet to travel beyond the galactic barrier, into the darkness that had nearly destroyed humanity during their original exodus. Only humans had ever survived that journey. And now they would have to make it again. 2,000 ships gathered at the edge of the galaxy, half of them human and half of them conquered, and together they prepared for the most dangerous mission in the history of intelligent life. They called it Operation Homecoming, a name that carried different meanings for different species, but resonated with all of them. For the humans, it meant returning to the void that had forged them. For the conquered, it meant fighting alongside the species they had once tried to destroy. For everyone, it meant either victory or the end of everything. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of the last light of Earth and addressed the combined fleet through a transmission that reached every ship simultaneously. "We are about to cross the barrier between galaxies," she said. "Many of you have never experienced the void, and I will not lie to you about what awaits us there." She paused and looked at the stars that filled her view screen, the familiar constellations of the Milky Way that she had memorized as a child on Earth over 2 millennia ago. "The darkness between galaxies is not empty," she continued. "It is wrong in ways that your minds will struggle to process, and some of you will break under the weight of it." Her voice softened. "But we will guide you through, just as our ancestors guided each other during the first Exodus, and together we will reach the heart of the silence and end this war forever." The fleet crossed the barrier in a single coordinated jump, and the conquered crews immediately understood why humanity had become what they were. The void was a place of absolute darkness and absolute cold, where the light of distant galaxies was too faint to see, and the emptiness pressed against the mind like a physical weight. Some conquered soldiers screamed and had to be sedated. Others wept without knowing why. A few simply stared into the darkness with expressions of blank terror, until their comrades led them away from the viewports. The humans moved through the fleet like shepherds, tending frightened animals, sharing techniques for surviving the void that they had developed over generations. "Do not look at the darkness," they said. "Look at each other instead. Remember that the emptiness is not alive. It cannot hurt you. It is just space. Sing if you need to. Talk if you need to. Just keep your mind focused on something other than the nothing." Young Kielvith III, grandson of the ambassador who had witnessed the first detection of the returned, served aboard a human vessel as part of the liaison program. He asked the ship's captain why humanity had chosen to come back and help the galaxy, instead of letting the conquered face the silence alone. The captain was a void-born human who had never seen Earth or any natural world until the return, and she considered the question for a long time before answering. "My ancestors could have let your people burn," she said. "They had every right after what was done to them, but they believed something that we still believe today." She turned to look at him with eyes that had seen nothing but artificial light for the first 20 years of her life. "What makes a species worthy is not how it treats its friends," she said. "It is how it treats those who wronged it, and we did not want to be defined by your sins. We wanted to be defined by our choices." Kielvith felt something shift in his understanding of the humans, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The fleet traveled through the void for 3 weeks, following coordinates that human scouts had mapped over centuries of exploration, and finally they reached their destination. The Silence's coordination node was a structure the size of a small moon, pulsing with light that seemed to come from nowhere, and when the fleet's sensors analyzed it, they detected the signatures of stolen consciousness from 1 million extinct civilizations. The enemy knew they were coming. The battle began before anyone was ready. Ships were torn apart by forces that no one could explain, reality bending and breaking around the fleet as the Silence fought to protect its heart. The human dreadnoughts pushed forward, their impossible weapons carving paths through the chaos, their crews singing battle hymns that had been passed down through 2,000 years of exile. Conquered ships fought beside them, their crews finding courage in the knowledge that they were not alone. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time meant nothing in that place of broken physics. The fleet pushed closer and closer to the node, paying for every kilometer with blood and wreckage. Finally, they reached the heart of the enemy. Admiral Tanaka studied the sensor readings and understood what needed to be done. A vessel would have to enter the node's core and detonate a weapon that would collapse its dimensional anchors, creating an explosion that would ripple across the void and destroy the Silence forever. The explosion would be unsurvivable. "I will go," she said, and no one tried to argue with her. She transferred command of the fleet to her second-in-command and ordered all other ships to retreat to a safe distance. Then she broadcast one final message to the fleet and to the galaxy beyond, her voice steady despite the weight of 2,000 years pressing down on her heart. "We were exiles," she said, "driven from our home by fear and hatred, forced to survive in a place where no one should be able to live." She guided her ship toward the pulsing heart of the Silence. "We became survivors, forged by the void into something stronger than we ever imagined." The node's defenses tried to stop her, but the last light of Earth was built to endure. "And now we choose to be guardians, giving our lives to protect a galaxy that once tried to kill us." She entered the core and felt reality begin to tear apart around her. "Let this be humanity's legacy," she said, "not what was done to us, but what we did with our pain." She activated the weapon. "Remember us not as monsters or martyrs, but as proof that any species can choose to be better than its worst moments." The last words she spoke before the explosion consumed her were simple and soft. "The stars are your inheritance now, earn them." The Silence ended. 10 years later, the galaxy had begun to rebuild. Monuments stood on 100 worlds, commemorating the human admiral who had saved existence, and children of every species learned her name alongside the heroes of their own civilizations. Humanity remained, smaller than before but unbroken, and new human children were born on conquered worlds where they played with alien friends and learned languages their ancestors had never heard. On the anniversary of the victory, Kielvith III traveled to Earth. The planet was being terraformed, slowly returning to life after 2,000 years of abandonment, and green shoots were beginning to emerge from soil that had been dead for longer than most civilizations had existed. He placed a Thessari morning flower at the base of a statue, depicting a human woman looking up at the stars. The inscription read, "Humanity, they left in sorrow, they returned in strength, they stayed in love." He stood there for a long time, watching the sky as new lights moved across it, human and conquered ships flying together toward destinations that neither species could have reached alone. The humans had not just saved the galaxy. They had shown it what was possible when hatred was set aside, and something better was built in its place. And in the quiet of that healing world, surrounded by the first new growth of a civilization reborn, Kielvith finally understood what the old ambassador had meant when she said the humans burned with something she could not name. It was hope. It had always been hope.